A huge conversation in the community this week sparked about classic albums, and nonetheless, the name that came up about having no classic albums was, of course, Drake. And when it came down to the conversation, people were debating, well, does he have a classic album? Because Ebro had gotten on his Apple Music show, and I kind of alluded to the fact that we will never get another classic album from Drake, and then people chimed in and said, well, doesn't have one to begin with, and to me, that's fucking ridiculous, considering everything that he did in the 2010s, regardless about how you feel post-beef, regardless about how you feel about his recent run in the 2020s, it's undeniable, bro, that this guy has classics in his catalog, and then if that wasn't enough, J. Cole entered the conversation, Kendrick Lamar entered the conversation, Lou was a fucking shit show this week.
It was a really crazy thing to witness, especially when it comes to the conversation of Drake, because Take Care is an undisputed classic album. And if you don't think so, you're probably a hater, bro. At this point, that's the conclusion that I've come to. Because when you look at what this album has done, bro, the way that he blended rap and R&B, gave you that vulnerability, how fresh the album sounds all these years later, Headlines being his theme song, Look What You've Done being the song that he started every show on the It's All a Blur tour. This was an album to last forever. And it has, bro. It's literally spent over 600 weeks on the Billboard 200 chart. If that doesn't mean an album is fucking timeless, I don't know what is at that point, right? And I think that that's the one that you really can't deny. And you could even name multiple classics from Drake. Even looking at a So Far Gone mixtape, which I don't even think is his best mixtape, that changed the game, bro. You had artists like J. Cole and others saying that they started taking their mixtapes more seriously and started treating them like albums after they saw the quality of So Far Gone and the impact that it made for Drake's career and for hip-hop as a whole. So I think with Drake, bro, it's a ridiculous conversation. But we should not be having it. There's the consensus. It's there.
You know what? When it gets down to the classic albums conversation with Drake, I thought we were past this. I felt like everyone, regardless of how you felt about his artistry, could at least admit that he has at least one in the catalog, let alone multiple. I do think he has multiple. I quote retweeted Complex Music's tweet when they had asked, how many classics does he realistically have? I think it's 3, bro. If you look at Take Care, Nothing Was the Same. If you read This Is Too Late, Nothing Was the Same is an undeniable classic, bro. You have classic records on there like a Pound Cake, like a Furthest Thing, like a Tuscan Leather, like a Hold On We're Going Home, a Started From the Bottom, bro. There's multiple tracks on that album, bro, that carried the entire sound of 2013. And again, like Take Care, has lived on the Billboard 200 chart forever. Looking at, if you're reading This Is Too Late, bro, that project was not even supposed to be released. Dropped in 2015 as a mixtape, bro. Dropped as a surprise mixtape. Became the sound of the summer, bro. People are still bumping that mixtape. To me, that's a classic mixtape in hip-hop. And the way that I kind of look at it, too, is these albums and projects dropped in a different era, right? Different marketing tactics, different fan bases, different listeners. You know, a completely different sound that people are gravitating towards. But yet, people are still talking about these albums and still trying to dissect them. People are going into them and absolutely loving them. They're still in rotation, but people are still celebrating the tracks. So I think for me, looking at this catalog, and we'll get into Kendrick after, because even someone brought in Kendrick and Cole, which I think is fucking ridiculous. The classics in those guys' catalog are still being celebrated all these years later in 2026 when the landscape of hip-hop has completely changed, bro. It's fragmented. You don't have the same types of fan bases, but yet they're still living the test of time, bro, and they're still in those types of conversations.
Absolutely. And I think that, yeah, with Drake, Nothing Was the Same. That was like the perfect Drake album. Concise, his best rapping of his career. When you look at one of the best artists of our generation giving us like their perfect album, that's what you look to. So I think he definitely has multiple classics. There's no fucking denying it. And I think that you could even argue for views, bro. I think that changed the game too. The way that it had mega hits, it dominated multiple summers, dominated the airwaves and still does, brought Afro beats and dancehall to a global stage. Underappreciated theme of the seasons changing. That's another one that you could throw up into the mix. Maybe that one is not as solidified as a Take Care, but I think that as more time goes, people will start to see that as a classic. But Academics chimed in too, and he took it
to a whole different level.
To a whole nother level, of course. He said that Drake has 6 classic albums, which is ridiculous. He named Take Care, Nothing Was the Same, If You're Reading This Is Too Late, Views, Scorpion, and Certified Lover Boy. That's where the glaze comes in, bro. There's no way Certified Lover Boy is a consensus classic album. It doesn't have the quality. It does not have the impact or influence yet. It's still so soon, but...
And what are the classic records off of that album? A Champagne Poetry, A Way Too Sexy. You only live twice? In the Bible? I don't know, bro. If you guys can name it in the comment sections, go for it, bro.
Race My Mind is pretty fucking amazing. But
That
no.
is an amazing song.
But
But
yeah,
you get what I'm
is
trying
it
to say,
a classic song, though? I don't know.
No, it isn't. And I think you have to be realistic when you look at the classic term, right? Because I think a classic could obviously strive in quality. It kind of has to. You can't drop a shit album and have it be considered a classic, but the influence is undeniable, right? Like going into Kanye's catalog, we were having this conversation earlier where I said, for example, I think The Life of Pablo is better than 808s and Heartbreak, but I would be quicker to name 808s and Heartbreak a classic album over The Life of Pablo. I still think both of them are classics in that regard, but you get what I'm trying to say, bro. Like, when an album has that type of impact and there's multiple artists that went on to have uber successful careers, they've dropped classics themselves, and they cite that album as a source of their inspiration. Now you could find a direct correlation to the influence it's had on the genre. It completely fragments it. Look at Whole Lotta Red, for example, right? You and I don't really fuck with that album as much as other people, but that completely broke all of hip-hop's rules. You had a whole scene that emerged just from that one studio album, and you saw the way that the Rage sound just took a different level, and it hit a different level of popularity after that album was released. For the 2020s decade, you could say it's one of the most defining albums in the genre. So I think you have to have a good conversation about it. A lot of the claims that I'm seeing on Twitter are just, here's my take, this guy's trash, he has no classics, and then conversation ends there. Why doesn't he have any classics? Is it album quality? Is it output? Is it a conversation of his influence? Like, I think that's where this conversation becomes flawed, and everyone that chimed in doesn't necessarily have a developed opinion. Is it just ends at one statement?
Yeah, and
or maybe a couple
I think
of lines.
that's also the nature, though, of X, right? Like, not people are not going to start writing Bibles explaining themselves onto why an album is a classic or why a certain artist doesn't have multiple classics, but at the end of the day, I do think people use the term way too loosely these days, bro, where it's like there's a difference between what a personal classic is to you or an album that you adore and what the masses have deemed to be a classic album. There's certain signs to look for, right? Like, a classic album needs to appreciate and value over time, bro. Like, this needs to stand the test of time. And that's why we bring up things like this album has spent years and years on the Billboard 200 chart, right? That's a sign of a classic album. Even looking at the J. Cole conversation, people brought him into the mix and said that he has no classic albums. But if you look at what happened in 2024, bro literally did a 10-year anniversary concert at Madison Square Garden for 2014 Forest Hills Drive and sold the place the fuck out, bro. He is obviously a huge artist, but he wouldn't have done that for the Sideline Story.
Why didn't he
wouldn't
do it
have
for
done
Born
that for
Sinner?
KOD? No. He did it for 2014 Forest Hills Drive because that's an album that connected with the masses. It had massive hits that weren't gimmicky. It was a multi-platinum album with no fucking features, iconic quotables, personal storytelling about someone's life and their origins. And that album also has spent over 570 weeks on the Billboard 200 chart, bro. People literally said, we're going to keep this in rotation forever.
Fuck that.
These are signs of a classic fucking album
And you know what's
that you
crazy
can't
is
deny.
that now, like, the album experience isn't as valued as it once was, right? Like, everything is super quick to be consumed. Streaming platforms changed everything. TikTok being in the mix obviously changes consumer habits, but yet these albums that you're finding on the Billboard 200 chart that are competing with albums that are releasing now, right?
Yep.
And these albums are formatted for better sales and better streaming. They're outperforming these albums. So I think that's also a clear indication of, bro, if they're able to still strive in this climate and there's still cult fan bases being amassed from those albums that were released 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, to me, that's a clear indication, right? And I think that you also have to be careful with that term, because when you say a classic album or iconic, when it comes to films, when it comes to TV shows, you often like to bring up Cars. I think the purists in those types of sectors, they're very, very careful with what they call classic, right? You look at, let's say, films, right? A movie buff could look at something like the first Jackass, which you were referencing before, and say, yo, like, that's a classic movie, right? Like, that changed sort of the format for comedy movies, brought in a whole different feel, bro.
Yeah, it was the first of its kind to do that.
It was a first of its kind. It birthed one of the most iconic franchises of the 2010s. Classic moments, classic characters, but you could still consider that a classic, but also something like a Shawshank Redemption or something from the Godfather's installment, not the third one, but Goodfellas, and you want to say Forrest Gump. Like, you have to be careful in those genres, what you call classic, or else you're gonna get outed out, bro. But I feel like in hip hop,
yeah.
like it's too loose, bro. It's way too fucking loose.
And that's another claim that I saw this week was people saying like, oh, like an album needs amazing storytelling. Like, no, bro, not every album needs fucking Slick Rick level storytelling to be considered a classic, right? Because again, looking at other mediums, something like the first Scary Movie, that is another classic fucking movie that doesn't have the best fucking dialogue or writing, no, but it had a fucking impact. It birthed a franchise. It birthed other parody movies. It was a groundbreaking fucking movie, the same way that Finally Rich for Chief Keef was. There's no fucking phenomenal writing on that album, but what it did for the drill scene and what it did for that entire movement in Chicago, that qualified it as a classic album. So I think that, you know, sometimes people are too loose with the term and other times people are too pretentious with it, where it's like, no, like it needs to be a good Kid Mad City level album. It needs to feel like a movie from start to finish. Like, no, you could have looser track lists that still have a groundbreaking impact that shift the culture in some way.
DS2 is the perfect example of that. I don't think anyone would dispute, at least in our community, that Dirty Sprite 2 is a classic album, bro. That is an undisputed classic. Bro, I'm not getting Sing About Me, I'm Dying of Thirst for that entire track list. There's no cinematic storyline that runs through the sequencing of that track list. But fuck it, bro. When I put up fuck up some commas, I think about Michael Phelps, bro, and I think about 2015, and I'm ripping my car, bro, because I'm hyped. And that's a sound that defined that year and that also birthed a whole new generation and took ATL Trap to a whole different place. Same thing with Culture by the Migos, right? There's classic records that everyone was singing word for word in clubs, at parties, bro, in commercials. Like, it's still charting to this day, and it's still doing what it's doing because you have the T-shirts, you have the Bad and Bougies, you have the Get Right Witches, you have the Slipperies, you have those types of records that are undeniable and that everyone fucked with at a certain moment
and
in time.
And it crossed mediums. You had
Yes.
Childish Gambino using Migos music in the show Atlanta. Like, again, these are just multiple indications of what can make an album a classic. And I think that it doesn't need to be a masterpiece. It doesn't need to be of a certain level of quality, though. That's for sure. That being said, it's interesting to see other people that are brought into the conversation. Big Sean is someone else. I think he's one of the more talented mainstream rappers of the 2010s, but there is still a gap between him and the big three. And a reason for that is that he doesn't have a classic album, in my opinion, right? Like, you could say that Dark Sky Paradise is the one that everyone says would be his classic, at least his most loyal fans would. But again, when you remove the Blessings and some of the more iconic tracks, and you move into like the second half of that track list, there's a lot of weak points. Same thing with Dark Sky Paradise.
But we're not Dark. You said Dark Sky.
Sorry, same thing with I Decided, right? Like, he tried to make a concept album about his rebirth, contextualizing his life decisions.
Great records on there too.
Amazing songs like The Light, great hits that like bounce back and moves, but the concept wasn't executed right. The songwriting is kind of spotty at certain times. He kind of just missed the mark with it. Also, Detroit. That's a fan favorite mixtape from Big Sean. Dope mixtape, not a classic, because you go to songs like 100, A Life Should Go On, and he's getting out-rapped by the features on there, like Kendrick Lamar, for example, or Wale, right? So the thing is, too, is that it needs to define a certain era. And when Detroit came out, you had Good Kid Mad City that came out that same year that kind of overshadowed it. So I feel like that's why we're so easy to put Take Care in 2014, Forest Hills Drive, and Good Kid Mad City in 1999 into these conversations, because when you think of the 2010s, those are the records that define that era. When you think of that era, those are the albums that come to mind. It's for good reason.
Yeah, and the quality conversation is obviously in play, but going back to the storytelling thing, Undone by the Roots, I don't think that people look at that as an absolute classic and staple within the genre, but I think everyone could agree that
it's a masterpiece.
That's a masterpiece of an album. And I think it was Punch on Twitter who actually spoke about this, that a perfect album doesn't automatically equate to a classic one. For example, You, right? And to a certain extent, me, I go to the Carter 3, and there's songs like Pussy Monster on there that do weigh down the track list, and not every song is like Let the Beat Build, and you're not finding a Milli verse on every single record, but that's a classic fucking album, bro. That is an album that defined an era. That was a boiling point for Wayne's career, which is one of the most iconic careers in all of hip-hop, and that's another conversation is there's only a certain amount of rappers that are able to play on that level. You have to build up your career to those points. Unless like you're an anomaly like Jay-Z or Nas, for example, where you come out and that's a debut classic, but that's also kind of done now at this point. I feel like the 50 Cent Jay-Z Nas formula, It's I don't think that happens anymore because those were at a time where the genre was still somewhat new and there was still so much room to be able to grow. At this point in time, I think artists do need to build up to their classic. They need to take time to be able to develop that. Look at Cole. He drops Friday Night Lights after dropping 2 prior mixtapes to that. There was a build up towards Friday Night Lights, which I think is a classic mixtape. You can kind of say Joey's also an anomaly when it comes to that because he dropped 1999, instant classic.
First breakout mixtape.
But same thing, let's say, with Kendrick, like he had to drop Overly Dedicated. He had to drop Section 80 and then develop his sound and work on his craft until he was able to reach a GKMC. Same thing with Drake, right? Like he had to go through the comeback season and all those pre-mainstream era projects before he was able to link up with YMCMB and drop So Far Gone. And then that exploded his career. And then you got that 3-album run, right?
I think it's also way harder these days for an artist to get a classic album just because now everyone is sharing their opinions, right? So now you have like just this massive pool of people that are always going to hate on something. Like it's hard to find an album that is going to get universal love. And I think that back, let's say in the 90s or the 2000s, you had, these institutions like The Source, and you had radio shows, and you had hosts, and like their opinion was kind of looked at with a certain level of value. Whereas now it's sort of like, well, the value is kind of fragmented because everyone is sharing their opinion and no one's word is really taken that seriously. And I think that it's also because of the culture of streaming services now where people move on from releases so quickly. So to get an album that really sticks with the masses, it's harder than ever to achieve that. And I think that what's also interesting is that we could think of so many legendary rappers that do not have a classic album, and that doesn't take... I mean, sure, it might reduce their spot on a final list of the best rappers.
But who cares
of all time.
about that? That's just
But
like game and barbershop
That
talk.
being said, though, like a Busta Rhymes, I think he's someone that has classic verses. Looking at his feature on Scenario, looking at his feature on Look at Me Now, looking at his verses on Everything Remains Raw, classic verses. But is The Coming really a classic album? I don't think so. So. Same thing with a Jadakiss, for example. He has classic songs and like Kiss the Game Goodbye with We Gonna Make It. Kiss of Death is a really phenomenal album. Great songs like Welcome to D Block. But did he ever really put out that classic album that everybody
And it's not as undeniable as a Snoop Dogg, for example, with something like Doggy Style. You could say like confidently that Jadakiss and Busta Rhymes are better rappers, lyricists, and MCs than a Snoop Dogg, but he has his classic album, so I don't think that it's the whole equation, right? When someone looks at a rapper and they say, oh, well, he has more classics, so he's automatically a better MC, I don't think that's completely true. Like the example you just gave, we could sit here and confidently say Busta Rhymes and Jadakiss might not have dropped a classic. I think to some New Yorkers and some other people that came from a different era, they would argue differently. But just for the sake of the conversation, does Snoop Dogg, have more to offer as an MC than those guys? No, I don't think nowhere near, bro. But he has a Doggy Style, and he helped birth G-Funk with Dr. Dre. So I think that's where this gets a bit hazy. But when it comes down to Kendrick, bro, that's when I was like, okay, this conversation's getting a bit fried at this point.
Bro.
Because at the same time, like, I understand where the Drake fans come from, right? They see their favorite artist getting attacked on a daily basis, and they tell themselves, well, time to go to the next best thing. Let's bring Kendrick Lamar into this conversation, and let's tear down his music too. And to me, it's like, no matter how you feel about Kendrick Lamar or what happened in 2024 with The Battle, there's undeniable classics. There's 3 of them in the catalog that define a generation, that were the best of their year, that spent countless weeks, hundreds of weeks on the Billboard 200 chart. And we're not talking about an album that came and went, right? That you see every fucking song charting in the top 30 of the Hot 100. The album lasts a couple of weeks on the 200, then it falls out. No, bro. There is hundreds of weeks for these albums. And it comes down to GKMC, it comes down to To Pimp a Butterfly, and it comes down to Damn. Those are 3 undeniable classics, and there is no fucking argument for them.
Yeah.
They match in quality, they match in impact. People are singing those songs word for word, and they're seen as staples within the genre.
And again, some people go off the wagon and say every album he's ever put out is a classic. I saw people saying, oh, Mr. Morale is a classic album. GNX will be a classic album. Section 80 is a classic album. I think that, you get the extremes from each and every fan base, but yeah, you have to look at, again, the signs that point to what makes an album a classic, and the 3 that you mentioned would be the ones that I would agree with. Another conversation, someone had a viral tweet saying no rapper has more than 3 classic albums. it's not that bad of a take just because there's not many you can think of. Obviously, Kanye West is an anomaly. He has over 5 classic albums, in my opinion. But when you look at Jay-Z...
You know, let's just go through them so no one takes this out of context. I think this should go without being said, but some people like to take the shit out of context.
College Trilogy, My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, 808s and Heartbreak.
And The Life of Pablo.
That
was a classic moment, bro.
Yeah.
That was a classic moment, bro.
That's a classic. Even the way that it changed, like, how you release an album and the way that you can sort of make edits in real time, like, that was a groundbreaking album. And yeah, I think that one you could safely say is also a classic album. I mean, some people would even throw Yeezus into the conversation.
And I don't blame you, bro.
I don't blame... That's it. It's like you could go all the way up to the number 8 almost with Kanye West, which is insane. But Jay-Z, 4 classics. Nas, maybe only 3 with It Was Written, Illmatic, and Stillmatic. Outkast.
And even Stillmatic is kind of like debatable in comparison, let's say, to what
I don't
was
think
written
Stillmatic is debatable, bro.
I think for some people it might be. I
think
think for you, I would say
I think that's a staple, bro.
it's still it's a phenomenal album, but I think in comparison to when it was written and Illmatic, those are solidified. I think Stillmatic, I would put it there. I would say it's a classic album, but I think some people would argue that it's not when looking at the rest of his catalog. Someone like, for example, Eminem, right? We often reference the 3-album run. All 3 of those albums are classic when it comes to the Slim Shady LP, the Marshall Mathers LP, and then after that, the Eminem Show. I can't call something like Recovery a classic or even Relapse, no matter how much I love those albums. They're not in the same tier. They don't have that same iconic status as those 3 albums that came out before it, right? So someone like Jay, Reasonable Doubt, The Blueprint, the Black Album, and 444. Those are undeniable classics. You can't have those conversations. If you try to argue against them, you look like a fucking idiot. And I think that's also what it is. There has to be a consensus feeling around that album being a classic. Like, just because your favorite artist drops an album, packs out a 1,000-person show, and everyone's singing it word for word, that doesn't represent the general feeling of the community. When we went to the Dreamville Fest, for example, there was songs 10 years later where you had 60,000 people reciting Love Yours word for word, or people looking at the No Role Models hook and people screaming their heart out because they love that record so much. So,
but you're gonna find that in every fan base, right? You go to a Rod Wave show or Rod Wave performing at a festival, you're gonna have fans screaming the songs word for word. That doesn't make a classic album.
No, multiple songs off an album. Or with 50 to 60,000 people in it.
If you go to the niche fan base of any artist, what you just described, you're gonna find that doesn't.
But you won't find that.
That's not enough to label an album a classic.
No, but I think you can, bro. Especially when it comes to packing out 50 to 60,000 people in an area, and you have multiple songs off of that album being sung, and people know them word for word. We're not talking about a couple of thousand people here. We're talking about tens of thousands of people off one album, not like your greatest hits that are fragmented.
Rod Wave does arena shows. Does he have a classic album?
No, obviously
thousands of people screaming out his songs.
I'm just saying, bro, you get what I'm trying to get at. Like, when you packing out those types of crowds and you have multiple songs off of a track list that are being sung word for word at multiple different cities on a tour leg, to me, that just means an undeniable influence.
Let me ask you this. Does an album need numbers and commercial success to be a classic album? Could we consider a Piñata by Freddie Gibbs a classic album if it hasn't hit the masses?
Yeah. Is Mad Villainy not a classic album?
Yeah.
I don't even think that charted on the 200 when it released.
But it changed the game.
It changed the game, and it has that influence
That's
factor.
the thing. I think it needs to have a massive impact the same way that Piñata did and defined that era, rebirthed Freddie Gibbs' career, the same way that, for example, Marsburg by Rock Marciano kind of influenced this whole scene of underground hip-hop where drumless beats became more popular. Like, I think sometimes you don't need to live on the Billboard charts. If you have the impact and the influence and you did something to shift the culture, especially in a positive way, then you could also enter that classic conversation.
Of course, same thing with 1999. It's not a mixtape with billions of streams, and it didn't go number 1. There's no songs on there that hit the Hot 100, but at the same time, like, 1999 is an undeniable classic within the genre. New York was still at that time. You had a 16-year-old Joey Badass that was, coming off of nothing, bro. Like, there was no prior work to say, okay, like, Kendrick built off of Section 80 and ADHD, and now he dropped GKMC. He had crazy mainstream verses, and bang, bro, he planted that album. That was quality off the rip, bro. He dropped that mixtape, and everyone knew automatically that this was going to be a staple in the genre, especially for the mixtape game and within that blog era. I also think it goes to eras, right? Looking at the Bling era, you have those types of albums that define that era. Looking at the mixtape and the blog era, you have certain projects that elevated that scene to a whole different level. Looking at the new rage scene, Whole Lotta Red, same thing. It took it to a whole different level, and it brought it to the forefront
And
of
everything's
hip-hop.
been almost trash since in that scene.
You could argue whether you like the influence. You could argue whether you
For
like the
sure.
influence or not. I don't give a fuck about that conversation. Like, if you look at within these runs and within these eras, there's certain projects that elevate it to a whole different level, and I think that's where you really look at the impact. So, interesting conversation in itself, Lou. I just think
is.
people need to go outside a bit, or people say like, bro, take the podcast mics away. I think that it would be interesting to see people actually make videos and real explanations, because now instead of just putting out the tweet, make a video about it, give a real explanation, show historical proof, go into a debate with it. That's why I think like this is an interesting format and medium for content creators, because now you're actually able to defend and back up your claims rather than just fucking spending hours spreading propaganda and you're just out there like spitting nonsense. So
For sure.
yeah, guys, let us know how you feel about the comment sections. Let us know, do you think Drake has 0 classics? I don't think you guys would, regardless if you're a K-Dot or Drake fan. I think you guys would tend to agree. But thank you so much for watching this video, and we'll catch you in the next one. Peace.